Traveling changes a man, you know.
Hello out there, this is Tyler Gooden.
And this is Zach Sutherland.
And this is the Traveling Podcast. We have a really interesting one for you here today, where we are going to be discussing art and literature that we discovered while abroad or somehow it influenced our traveling experience. And we're going to kick this off right away by turning this over to Zach a little bit. Zach, when you were abroad traveling around, did you discover any written literature or art, film that you would have never known about if you had not been abroad?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I did. The first one was really when I was in Finland. I was in a school at the University of Oulu, and I took Finnish literature. And as part of a project we had to do, I had to read a novel by a Finnish author. And I chose this novelist. Well, the novel was called The Unknown Soldier, and I believe the guy's name was Väinö Linna. And so I read that novel, and then I had to do a report on it. And
so this was an assignment in your school.
Right. It really introduced me to a lot about Finland that I didn't know before, sort of like their sense of humor. And I remember actually being I procrastinated so much that I would read. Towards the end, I would read every other page because I had to just get it done and be able to do this book report.
Yeah.
But I had a book report, like a report with, I was supposed to do a presentation, but I just met with my professor, who's a young Finnish guy, a really cool guy. And he said that I had one of the best presentations, amazingly.
And
but
you just did the Cliff Notes.
Yeah, and I read every other page towards the end of the novel. But I just remember the reason why I think I probably did well on it was I loved it.
Yeah.
The book is about, I believe it's World War I. The Finns were fighting against the Russians.
That's the Winter War.
It's the Winter War, yeah. And I just remember the first paragraph of it that was so Finnish. He wrote his sentences in it was dark, It was sarcastic, and it was dry.
Do you remember what he was saying?
I think he was describing some kind of setting, like some kind of Finnish countryside. The snow was white, and the sun tried to find its way through the horrible Finnish Christmas trees, which destroyed any semblance of light that would not reflect upon the shimmering snow or some.
First of all, is he considered a great Finnish writer? Like, it sounds like he was some kind of importance if the school was asking you to read it. But is that like Finnish poetry?
Well, I mean, some prose, it was novel, but some prose can be poetic. But
right.
Trust me, that's not a very good imitation. But anyway, there was also one scene that the author described in the story where the Finnish soldiers, and this relates back to sort of the Finnish mindset towards authority a little bit, because they've been taken over by like Sweden and Russia, and they're just very like kind of anti-authoritarian. But the soldiers there's like a air raid. The Russians were dropping bombs, and these Finnish guys, the captain or the sergeant told them to stand at attention.
Right.
These three guys, they're standing at attention, saluting, and then this air raid comes. And the three guys, they stay at attention. And the sergeant's like, "Why are you still standing? What are you doing? Get down." And like, "Sir, we are still standing for your attention." That's a terrible accent, but we're still waiting. It relates back to sort of it's a little bit ironic, like very sarcastic, like you told us to do,
yeah.
And in an anti-authoritarian.
Now, in terms of your traveling and learning about Finland and Finnish literature, what is it that made that story significant for one, for you, but also for the school? Is it because it was it was about their history, was that an important writer to them, this writer?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, he's definitely, I think I was recommended that book by the literature professor that I was taking the class with. He said it was one of the great, Finnish novels, sort of like anti-war novels, sort of like, I guess maybe you could probably relate it to like Ernest Hemingway,
right?
I would think.
And his name was Väinö
Linna, I believe that's it.
Linna, the Unknown Soldier.
Yeah, and it's The Unknown Soldier. And for me, it was just really cool because it totally reflected all the other characteristic of the Finnish soul, I guess
Okay.
you could say, and that kind of related back to my girlfriend at the time. She would tell me things about Finnish people, and then I'm reading this novel,
Right.
and I could kind of see, oh yeah, I can see how the Finns are, but it's everybody's culture and history is based, how people are
Yeah.
based on their history.
And leading into something that I read, and when I was influenced abroad, I think that one of the reasons why we chose this particular subject is exactly what you just said. It says a lot about the Finnish soul. I think we look to art and literature to tell us a lot about the cultures that we don't know or understand, especially abroad, because the U.S. culture is it's universal. It's intentionally designed, especially with like Hollywood and these things. It's intentionally designed to make money, so it's trying to appeal to a very wide audience. Whereas if you go to different parts of the world, it's more provincial. It's based on their culture. Like if you watch a Czech film, it's going to be about it. What used to be anyway. I think they're becoming more commercial. But back in the day, I could watch a Czech film and learn so much about the Czech Republic. Which leads me into my experience with. There's so many experiences, but I chose to, because we're talking about literature at first, to talk a little bit about a writer that I discovered while abroad. I kind of discovered, not exactly on my own. It's a writer from Poland named Bruno Schulz. He was a Jew during the World War II, and he was actually killed. And he had written a really big body of work, but not all of it was published, and a lot of it was lost during the war. But they published a book called The Street of Crocodiles and Cinnamon Shops. The prose is so beautiful, and he's the way he describes things. It's so tactile, and you can feel yourself in this environment, and it's very very Eastern European in the sense of it's very surreal and very descriptive. And the reason why I'm choosing him is because I kind of knew the Street of Crocodiles. I had already heard of that because when I was in art school, I watched the Brothers Quay animated movies, and they're these puppet animation movies, and they're very strange and sort of seem like they're almost from another time. And they made a short movie called Street of Crocodiles, and the Street of Crocodiles was influenced directly from Bruno Schulz. So they were pulling from this Eastern European lore, which was a lot of it around puppetry and marionettes. And so they took Bruno Schulz's short story and they made a short movie, which was really abstract, but you can kind of see some influence if you were to read that book. But that book was a beautiful, really well-written book, and I kind of want to keep Bruno Schulz alive a bit. He was also an illustrator. He was like a Polish Franz Kafka, and kind of how they described him. Now, the Brothers Quay were highly influenced by a Czech filmmaker named Jan Švankmajer. And Jan Švankmajer was one of the early surrealist filmmakers. He made a lot of stop-motion animation, but not like your Disney fun movies. They were really dark and surreal. I think you said you've seen Alice in Wonderland. He's done a bunch of them, and he used like lots of Czech fairy tales and lots of influence from the Eastern Europe. But the funny thing about Jan Švankmajer is when I was in art school, for part of my internship, I was helping my professor do a video installation. And I was asking him, what do you think about Jan Švankmajer? Do you like his stuff? And he said, well, I have a funny story about Jan Švankmajer. My college, one of the students when I was at college, his father wrote a book called How the Irish Did Something. I don't remember what it was. And he, I guess, I don't know why he said that, but he said my friend was in love with Jan Švankmajer, and he moved to Prague and went and worked for Jan Švankmajer. Ended up making Little Otik, one of his last movies, and actually found a way to work with Jan Švankmajer. He worked really hard to get in with the Jan Švankmajer group. And right after Dan told me that, and this goes back to serendipity and travel, right after that happened, I went into the bookstore. I think it was within the same couple of days, and I walked by a bookshelf, and it said, there was the book right there in front of me, and it was How the Irish Did Whatever It Was, and it was written by so-and-so Cahill. And I went to Prague, and I actually have some mutual friends of this guy Jason who worked with Jan Schwankmeyer, and I actually have a story about me trying to meet Jan Schwankmeyer, which I'll tell after our next little segment that we're about to do, which is going to be a surprise. It's our first one, and then we'll come back to sort of close out our experience with literature and art abroad. Now, what that meant by our next segment is a new idea that we're doing called Word Salad. So Word Salad is a game that we're going to play where at least one of us brings a word that we find interesting beyond its name. So it can be a word that has some historical significance or some sound in it that we didn't realize was related to our own language, or something that we never knew meant something else. To kick it off as an example, I'm going to give a word to Zac that I think he's going to guess what it means because of his knowledge, but we'll see. And then I'm going to explain what I know about that word. So, Zac, the first word in our game of word salad from me is Belarus. Do you know what that means?
I believe it means White Russian, right? Russia.
That's correct.
Yeah. Because I had a Belarusian student, and I don't know, I just look up stuff like that sometimes, you know.
Great.
So that's the national, by the way, White Russian is the national drink of Belarus.
Oh, you ruined my surprise at the end. No,
okay.
It's okay. It's fine. Yeah, actually, and these are short. This is a short game that we're going to play, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but that's exactly right. So anytime you see in the Slavic languages, if you see Bielo or Biela, you can see even last names like in Slovak, like Bielo or Biela. It means white, and so Belarus means White Russian. And on that note, isn't the pronunciation of Russia? It's actually would be Rossiya, right?
Rossiya.
Rossiya.
I believe it's
Belarusia. So that's what it means. And just a quick historical context is that it was always called that. But then I used to think that it was like when the Bolsheviks were called the Red Russians. I thought that it was in contrast to that. But apparently there's a lot of debate about why it's called White Russia. So anyway, that's the word salad game of today. Unless, Zac, did you have one that you wanted to?
Can you guess what this word is? Cha.
In what language?
I'm not going to tell you. Cha.
Cha? I think it means dance in Latin languages. Cha cha cha.
Right. Okay, I'll give you another one. That's in one language. Chai.
Chai is tea. Yeah.
So the cha, I believe, is in Chinese and Mandarin. It's cha. In Russian, it's chai.
Chai.
In Romanian, I think it's probably some variation of cha or
Very
chai.
similar, yeah.
But the point is that did you know, Tyler, that there's only two ways in all languages that you can pronounce tea, the word for tea, what we call tea. It's either some variation of cha or chai or some variation of tea.
Tea or te, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, te or tea or cha or yeah, I mean it makes sense to me now. If I had to guess in relationship to a drink, I would have definitely guessed tea, because I didn't know that it was only one variation, te, tea or cha, chai.
Yeah.
That is amazing. That is a really good word salad. That's a good example.
Because and if you think about it, what was traded in history throughout our history of trade,
Right.
whenever the West and the East kind of met, what was traded
Tea.
the most?
Te.
Tea.
Chai.
Absolutely.
Cha.
Way more so than coffee or beer even.
Interesting.
It was tea. So anyway.
That's a perfect example of word salad. So that ends this segment of Word
Word
Salad.
Salad.
We're going to have those each episode, so you'll have something to look forward to. So I'm going to finish off my Jan Schwankmeyer story, and then we're going to head out with Zac telling a little bit more about his experiences with literature abroad. I just want to say real quickly that Jan Schwankmeyer was a big influence on me when I went to Prague. Like I had already been watching his movies. I was already interested in his work, and one of the first things I did was when I arrived in Prague was find his museum. Now his museum was also where he lived, and it was near the castle, and you could go up and go into his museum, and he had all these amazing surrealist paintings, weird, like crazy surrealist art. You could buy any of his artwork. And I went up to his museum, and I didn't know it was his house at the time, but the museum was closed, and somehow or another I ended up trying to find my way in, and I ended up on his property. Jan Schwankmeyer and his dogs chased me out of his house. So like here's my one of my hero filmmakers comes out on the balcony with his dogs and starts to like yell at me and tells me to get off his property and sends his dogs to chase me, and I had to run away from his property and run away from Jan Schwankmeyer.
He didn't know you were coming, or what's?
He didn't know why I was there. I was trying to get into his museum, and I didn't know I didn't understand where I was, and I ended up walking around to, I think, his back door or something, and it was where he lived too.
Okay.
He also lived there. And then the last thing about him is I had heard about Jason had worked on his movies, and I was working in the movies at the time, and I ended up trying to also work with him, and I ended up meeting some of his team, and I got really close to working with him, but I don't think he ever made another movie, or at least not when I was there. But they had me, I had a chance to meet with them and talk to them about working. I was really expressed a lot of interest in working with them. I got really close to working on it, but I never quite made it to that. But I thought that was really interesting. Jan Schwankmeyer was a huge influence on why I knew anything about the Czech Republic, except I used to think his name was Jan Svankmajer because the J's are pronounced Jan.
Yeah.
And Jan, and by the way, another word salad bit, Jan, of course, is another way of saying John.
Right.
Jan. And they had the longer version of Jan is Honza. Honza is the Czech version of like Jonathan, I guess you could say. But
Yeah.
So that's my short arts and literature bit. There's tons of arts and literature to talk about abroad, but that was mine. So do you have any more little short stories of your experience with literature or art abroad?
Well, yeah, when I was in Russia, this was like 2005, 2006, and I didn't have internet at the house or apartments I was staying at, so I would look for books to read, and one of my friends introduced me to Mikhail Bulgakov, and he's a Russian writer during the period of around early 1920s, 30s, 40s. He wrote a book called The Master and Margarita. The premise of the book is the devil comes to Moscow. This is in the 1930s, and there's these two guys sitting on a park bench, and he begins to have a conversation with them where he is sort of talking about history. He says he's a foreigner from Germany. Of course, he speaks perfect Russian, and they're impressed by that, but they're talking about religion. And so keep in mind, this is during the 1930s, communism.
Right.
All the communists are very much atheists.
Yeah.
And anytime you talk about religion, it's sort of like you have to bash it, right? You have to say Christianity is a terrible disease or whatever. So this Satan comes and he's arguing with these guys about Christianity and about Jesus, and eventually he backs up. I guess he kind of backs up all of his statements with lots of really good facts and things like that. And then he looks at one of them and he says, "By the way, you're going to lose your head. You're going to die. You're going to lose your head."
Yeah.
And that guy somehow they part, and that guy ends up like falling into a train track, and then his head gets chopped off somehow.
Yeah.
He loses his head. And then there's also this talking cat.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then there's also this scene where all of these Russian writers for a newspaper, they all just randomly all start singing the same song in unison. And they cannot stop singing the song because there's some kind of spell. But there's this one scene in the book that's kind of interesting. It's where it goes back and forth from, in a historical perspective, to Jesus being interrogated by Pontius Pilate, after he's accused of all these crimes. And at one point, Jesus is talking with Pontius, and he says, "You really don't, it's not that you don't like me, it's just that you have a terrible headache." This is all related to your health.
And isn't that magical realism? Isn't it that's what makes it magical realism, isn't it?
Well, that's more the Jorge Luis Borges, but it is sort of magical realism. Related to that story, I had a student one time, and his favorite novel was Mikhail Bulgakov. This is when I was an English teacher for adult classes, and he told me at one point, I was I guess grading them or telling them if they're how evaluating their English, and he says, "It's not that you don't like my English or I'm making mistakes. You just have a terrible headache."
And you got the joke.
Yeah, and I totally understood it.
Yeah.
The Russians at the time, they were so interested in literature, and like one of my students were like, they were asking me for an entire class on the novel It by Stephen King, which I was reading at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And they were so interested in it. They're like, it's just very well read. But the Mikhail Bulgakov thing is, I encourage everyone to check it out, because like bands like Pearl Jam have a song called Pilot, and it's based on that novel. Or like, there's so many like connections. It's huge.
It's a big novel. Yeah.
It's amazing satire.
Yeah.
And you can really learn a lot about Russian history, because famously there's a famous Russian idiom saying like, books don't burn.
Yeah.
And that relates to when Mikhail Bulgakov was writing the novel, he eventually wanted to burn it, because it was satirical about the Russian government.
Okay.
And it's one of those things where he would get in trouble very much. So he burnt it. But then his wife somehow kept a copy of it, and the novel kept coming back, or she somehow resurrected the like an earlier draft, or he rewrote it, or and he put that idiom in the story of The Master and Margarita. Books don't burn. And
amazing.
It's very
I love that idea that it needed to be in the world somehow, and the world found it. I think there's actually I got in touch with somebody, I think a Russian, that was trying to make that movie about 3 or 4 years ago, and tried to help him get it made, and it never went anywhere. But that's a very important piece of Russian literature, but also great literature. It's a fun read.
Yeah. So I read that novel when I was in St. Petersburg, and just very impressed with it. It is just, I don't know, like a wealth of information about, like I was saying earlier, like the Finnish character that was like the Russian character, and that was like full of so many interesting things about how Russian writers had to like disguise their work, and it couldn't be released until gosh, it wasn't even published in Russia, even though it was written in the 40s, until like maybe the 80s, or in America it was published in like the 60s, and just
on that note, and because I think we're getting close to the end, one note that a lot of these artists and writers during that era, during the Stalinist era especially, they had to, it's so strange to even have to say it, but they had to hide their expression a lot, and they couldn't express themselves the way that we can freely in the West, or they would of course be persecuted or even jailed or killed. And so one of the Czech strategies was to do really naive art. Like a lot of their work was it looked really naive and kind of ridiculous and silly, so that it was harmless. The Soviet idea of great art was social realism, so it had to look real. That's why you see the painters of the workers, and this sort of like idealizing the worker and Stalin and the Soviet society, the communist society. So the Czech response to that was to make these little almost childlike. It was almost like a childlike artwork that really said what they really wanted to say. So I think that is an important topic, and maybe in a future episode we could talk about the political aspects of art and the defiance. For example, the Velvet Revolution. Václav Havel was the first president of the new Czech Republic, and he was friends with the Rolling Stones. And there's a story going around that the lights that were lighting the Prague Castle were donated by the Rolling Stones, because they came to visit this poor country, and like, why don't you have any lights on your castle? And Havel was like, well, we don't have any lights. And what I meant to say about Havel was a playwright. The first president of the free country of Czech Republic was an artist, which is pretty profound. And he was a dissident artist at that. He was against the regime. And in the Velvet Revolution is named the Velvet Revolution because it was peaceful, but also there's folklore as well that a lot of the reason why they chose that name was because all the dissidents were really into the Velvet Underground, like Havel and the guys, or whoever was sneaking back into Czechoslovakia at the time, were bringing back cassette tapes from New York of all these like bands like the Talking Heads or the Velvet Underground. So that art and music and literature, this is important it's not just entertainment. It is as important as a doctor. I mean, the arts and the expressions of our humanity, of our conscious, our national identity, these are found through the arts. And we wouldn't know about these cultures as well as we do if not for these artists.
I haven't even mentioned Dostoevsky and his amazing ability to, as a psychologist and as kind of he made predictions about the future in certain novels based on what would happen in the future with the taking over of communism and Lenin,
and it came true.
And it came true, yeah. And I just feel like Russians say like the Russian language is very deep, and their history of literature is very rich, and
right.
I totally believe that. I read Crime and Punishment when I was in St. Petersburg, and Raskolnikov is the major character there. And like that novel is set in St. Petersburg, so it's kind of, and like Dostoevsky, he lived in Petersburg, and just sort of reading that novel and just imagining
being
like,
there,
like oh, Raskolnikov maybe walk down
this street. It was the same. It was the same with me. I mean, we really have to wrap it up. I just really quickly want to end on 2 quick points. It was the same with me watching Amadeus, which I love that movie. We can talk about that sometime because there's so much word salad in that name, Amadeus. Why did they name it that? But I remember that was made in Prague, and I remember walking down those streets and seeing where Milos Forman shot it. I remember one of the first books I read in Prague was The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. Beautiful, one of my favorite books. It's the only book that as soon as I finished it, I turned around and started reading it again. But it was so amazing that's another thing for travelers out there. Pick a book about the place you're traveling and read it while you're there, because it gives you another taste. It gives you the taste that only art and literature can give your mind and your spirit. So I think that's a good way to end our episode on arts and literature abroad. And we are trying to start a tradition of tongue twisters, but I just realized I didn't bring one. Do you have a tongue twister?
How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
Yeah, that does sound like a foreign language. Is his name Chuck?
Yeah, and he has a wooden house.
How about an idiom? How about anything clever or smart from another culture that we can maybe marinate on this week?
Okay, let's see. Well,
okay, I've got one. All right, so I can't think of a tongue twister off the top of my head, but I do have a really funny one that the Czechs say, that all the Czechs say it, and if there's any Czech person out there listening, they know it's coming. It's a little phrase that they say at the end of every sentence, in the middle of the sentence, at the beginning of the sentence, and it is the funniest thing. They say "ti vole," like we say "dude." They say like "ti vole," and it means you bull. It means you bull, like the animal bull, as I understand correctly. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. It's like you bull. They just keep saying it, and they'll say it like we say dude, and they'll be like T-vole, T-vole, T-vole. And be like, hey, Zach, T-vole, what are you doing tomorrow, T-vole? And they say it at the end and in the beginning and the middle of everything, and it doesn't really mean anything. It has no real significance other than like how we say dude or or something like that.
Well, in Russian, I know that they'll say prosta, which means simply. So that's like their way of saying. I mean, nowadays in English we say literally a lot. It's
in Italian they say dai, or they say allora, allora. It means like okay, okay, allora. So it's funny, we all have our little like filler words that we say. And for the Czechs it's ti vole. For us it can be dude or And in Russian,
prosta.
Prosta, yeah. Prostye. Oh, in Czech they say prostye. They say prostye. Yeah.
But
great. I think that was a great episode. I really enjoyed learning about literature and arts from different parts of the world. Thank you, Zach, for introducing me to these writers. I already knew about Master and Margarita, but I'm really curious to read Unknown Soldier now. And I hope you guys out there enjoyed that and got some insight into travel, and I hope it inspires you to follow some sort of a similar path, because it is one of the most rewarding things you could ever do, is to pick up a backpack and just go.
Adios, everybody.
Adios. Do
svidaniya.
Traveling changes a man, For better or worse, who could say? But when I die, don't you tell them I went out this way. Tell them I said something. Yeah, tell them I said something great.